Hello, my name is Lucas Morneau, and welcome to the first ad hoc workshop mini tutorial. Today's tutorial will be going over the exposure triangle and two other main components to videography and photography that helps ensure that your image looks the best that it can. So, what is the exposure triangle? The exposure triangle is a triangle made up of three important components to photography that helps ensure that your exposure is perfect every single time. These three components include the sensitivity of your film or sensor, the aperture of your camera, and the shutter speed of your camera shutter. We'll be going over these three components as well as the focus and the white balance of your camera. And these five components altogether will help you ensure that every single time you pick up a camera, that your video looks perfect. So let's get to it. ISO. Your ISO is the number that determines how sensitive to light your sensor and your film will be. This number has been determined by the International Organization for Standardization, thus ISO. The higher the number is, the more sensitive your film or sensor will be to light. So let's take something like ISO 100. This is roughly what most films are rated at, between 100 and 400. And we have a nice amount of grain that isn't too noticeable, so therefore we're able to get some great details in our image. The downside is that the moment that we try to shoot indoors, we have to open our aperture up to a point that the slightest of miscalculation of focus means that you might have an image that is not sharp. So, how can you solve this? Let's take this image here that was shot with a high ISO. The image still has some good detail, however, you can see that it started to degrade. Specifically, if we look into the darker areas of the image showing our shadows, we can see a lot of tiny dots. And if we zoom in, these dots are made up of a bunch of different colors. So what this is noise. The higher your ISO is, the more noise will be brought into your image. And this noise will actually disrupt the details in your image and make it less detailed. So, do you want to have a high ISO so you can shoot in low light? Or do you want a low ISO so that you can have extremely fine detail and low noise or grain? The choice is up to you. Aperture. Your camera's aperture, or really your lens's aperture, is the pinhole that allows light to pass through the lens and hit the film plane or the sensor of your camera. So, much like our eye, our aperture can dilate and it can open up and allow more light in. However, there's a caveat to that. When we open our aperture larger and allow more light in, we actually decrease our depth of field. And what our depth of field is the area of which is in focus whenever we are focusing the lens. So if you have a narrower depth of field, that plane of what's in focus is much more narrow and shallow. Therefore, if something is slightly out of focus, it's going to look really out of focus. Whereas if you're using a smaller aperture, if something's slightly out of focus, chances are it'll actually look like it's in focus. So let's take these two photos for example. Here we have a photo of a duck mascot on a table. In our first photo here, we are using aperture f/22. This allows almost everything in the photo to be sharp, whether it be in the foreground, the midground, or the background. And let's take a look at this second photo. This one was captured at f1.8, and wow, can you tell? As you can see, the depth of field on this photo is much more narrow than the first. Therefore, the area in which I focused on, the eye of the mascot, is really the only area in the photo that is in focus. And we can say the same thing in video as well. If you notice, I am switching my focus around in both of these videos. And what we can see is that with a narrower depth of field, like in f1.8, you're going to have more drastic changes in focus than you would have at f22. Shutter speed. The shutter speed is the amount in fraction of a second, in fact, of how fast the shutter of the camera opens and closes, and therefore takes a picture. If we're doing still photography, the shutter moves once to create a single exposure. Whereas, if we're doing a video, this shutter will move so many times a second to ensure that we have enough frames to create a smooth image or a smooth video. Generally, within North America, we shoot at 24 or 30 frames per second and as high as 60 frames per second. You'll find cameras that have higher frames per second than this. However, this is generally used for slow motion shots. In Europe, the standard is 25 frames per second. So, when it comes to still photography, the shutter speed also can play a really fun effect. The faster the shutter speed, the more likely things will freeze in place within a photo. So, if we're doing something that's 1/2000th of a second, we're able to freeze it within time and space. A single droplet freezes. A speeding car stands still. The moment that we open that shutter curtain for longer, the more likely things and time moving around us will affect our image. So, if we're trying to capture that perfect shot of a baseball player hitting a baseball, we have to ensure that our shutter speed's quite fast to get that perfect shot. Now, when it comes to video, there's something important to keep in mind. Your shutter speed is important for determining the frames per second. One of the better ways to kind of forget about it is to ensure that the shutter speed matches your frames per second by doubled. So if you're shooting at 30 frames per second like I am right now, you want to ensure that your shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you're going to aim for around 50. Now, you can shoot outside of this, but it's generally best to shoot within this range throughout your whole video, or else you start to see some strange effects. White balance. So your white balance is the color temperature of your image. In the past, when we bought film, especially color film, sometimes you would see either a D or a T in the name of the film. This determined if the film was meant for daylight or for tungsten light. And what's the difference between the two? So, light in terms of color temperature is measured in the Kelvin scale. Tungsten light, which is generally the color temperature of light that we use indoors, is roughly 3,300 Kelvin. Whereas daylight hovers around 5,600 to 6,000 Kelvin. How does this affect our image? Well, if we take a plain piece of white paper, like so, the white that we see reflected from the light will be different depending on the quality of light. So if we're in an area that has tungsten lighting, this white will appear more yellow-orange, whereas in daylight, it will look more blue. We need to ensure that our sensor or our film matches the quality of light that we're filming in, or else we'll have a weird shift in color. If we shoot a tungsten setting outdoors, our image is going to look blue. Whereas if we shoot indoors with daylight settings, indoors it's going to look very orange. So we have to ensure that we have these settings set so our whites in our image look white, not yellow and not blue. Focus. This one's sort of self-explanatory. The focus is whatever your lens has focused on, and therefore is highlighting as the subject of your image or your film. This can be thrown off by your aperture. So as we talked before about depth of field, this is a continuous moving field when we move our focus on our camera. And the smaller our aperture, the wider this depth of field. So the more things will be in focus. If we were to, let's say, shoot a portrait, and we wanted to ensure that everything besides our subject was out of focus, we would ensure our aperture is wide open, allowing for a narrower depth of field, and therefore less things will be in focus. So I hope that this mini tutorial helped you understand a little bit better what happens when you're trying to take a video with a DSLR camera or a cinema camera. These days, we're quite lucky that we have iPhones and other cell phones and even other automatic cameras that does everything for us. However, it's always good to know these things because the more that you know them, the more control that you have. And therefore, you can determine what kind of a feel or tone or atmosphere your video or pictures have. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Lucas Morneau, and have a wonderful day.